The Pharaoh sat listlessly on his throne. Here he was, the most powerful man on earth, a king of kings and lord of lords. He ruled from the third cataract of the Nile all the way to the delta. He was overlord of kingdoms far beyond that. And yet, he could not shake the feeling that someone was disrespecting him. Someone was laughing at him. He called to his vizier, who appeared at his feet with reassuring haste. Vizier, tell me again what is happening with those Hebrews. He spat the word, as if it left a bad taste in his mouth. When are they supposed to be back? The vizier bowed down so low that Pharaoh thought he heard his teeth scraping against the floor as he tried to speak, which prompted the Pharaoh to kick him with his gold-encrusted sandals and order him to lift his head and speak clearly. They promised to go 3 days into the wilderness, my lord, and worship their desert god. But then they were to come straight back. The Pharaoh studied his impeccably manicured fingernails. 3 days. And a few to sacrifice, you say, and then straight back? And tell me then, how long ago did they leave? The vizier gulped. It has been about 2 weeks, my lord, and I'm afraid there has been no sign of them since. Do you think that maybe it might be time for us to do something about that? The grand stables were Pharaoh's favorite place in all the land. He made a point of visiting them every day if he possibly could. He loved the horses. There were hundreds of them in an endless row of stalls. He loved their smell and the sound of their whickers and their nickering. Most of all, he loved that they were a sign of his great wealth, for they were the finest horses in all the world. And each one of them, each one was worth 150 shekels of silver. More money than an average Egyptian man could earn in 5 years of his life. But more than the horses, Pharaoh loved what was housed in the garages across from them, his chariots. They were made of iron and inlaid with ivory and silver, each one a work of art, and, more important, each one a terrifyingly efficient killing machine. But here was the real secret about the chariots. Each one of them was worth 4 times as much as just one of the horses. That meant that this stable and these horses and these chariots together, and together with the royal stables spread throughout the land, constituted the greatest accumulation of wealth in all of Egypt. This was more than the temples and the palaces and the pyramids, and the only way that such wealth could be created and maintained was through a vast military industrial complex. And Pharaoh was angry because someone was threatening that military industrial complex. It was Moses, of course, that traitor to the land that had raised him. For Moses had made the Hebrews think that they had value beyond the labor that they provided. He had deluded them into thinking that some god knew who they were and actually cared about their worship. Pharaoh had been far too indulgent in letting them go. And now we understand that such ideas were dangerous, so dangerous that they could upset the proper order of a society. For if slaves were allowed to think that they could shirk their work, any slave could do that. And it would destroy the supply chain that maintained these magnificent machines of war. Pharaoh did not dare to admit it to anyone, but this was exactly the kind of thing that could destroy the power of a kingdom. Something had to be done. And so it was that a few days later, Pharaoh found himself riding towards the Sea of Reeds in the midst of a massive company. There were 600 of Pharaoh's own chariots, and they had been joined by the mass cavalry of the wealthiest nobles in all Egypt. And as he felt the wind blowing through his robes, Pharaoh let out a great whoop, as if he were a boy on his first ride. The horses' hooves beat on the plain in such great numbers that it sounded like thunder. The dust of the wheels, kicked up, made a cloud that would be visible for miles away. It was a divine cloud of justice that would drive those rebellious slaves into the sea. Now, the king knew that he was being extreme. He didn't need over 1,000 chariots to bring down a few miserable slaves in a huddle. Why, just one chariot was enough to make 100 men turn and run in panic terror. And that effect was multiplied many times over by the addition of a few more war machines. Rarely was it the spears or the arrows of the chariots that turned the tide of a battle. No, their mere appearance on the field was enough to make even the strongest men flee. Running through these slaves would be like cutting a piece of papyrus with a sharp sword. But this was what Pharaoh needed, an overwhelming display of terror that would make everyone think deeply about trying anything like this again. Finally, the scouts returned, and they reported to the generals that the slaves had been spotted. They were huddled together in a makeshift camp just by the edge of the Sea of Reeds, a marshy lake that was famously treacherous to anyone who would seek to cross it. "Ah," said Pharaoh to himself, this is perfect. All the chariots need to do is a maneuver that we have practiced 1,000 times. We will charge forward straight towards the slaves, wheeling away at just the last minute. Oh, it never fails. The fools will be so terrified that they will run straight into the bog. They will tumble and fall and be drowned before the day is through." He called out to his men, telling them to ride as swiftly as the wind. Their victory was near. The battle did not go as Pharaoh had imagined it would. First of all, the famous cavalry of Egypt made a wrong turn, and so did not come to the Sea of Reeds until night had fallen. And Pharaoh knew that it was far too dangerous to order a charge when neither the charioteers nor the horses could see the terrain. But worse than the darkness was the thick, heavy fog, so unseasonable at this time of year, that enveloped them all so that no one could see. The men, even the king, had to make do with field rations, for the Pharaoh's cook tent and his slaves had gone missing in the confusion. The men began to grumble of ill omens and dark sorcery. The infuriating part was, though, that you could hear the sounds of the Hebrew camp, the slaves jabbering away in their barbaric tongue. And occasionally there was a shout that could only be coming from that bastard Moses. He was calling out, Yahweh will fight for you, and you only need to keep still. That, by the way, was the only way to defeat a chariot. You had to stand there and let the thing run straight at you without flinching. The horses didn't know what to do when people weren't terrified. They often stopped in their tracks, full of confusion. They weren't trained, as war horses would be later, to run people down. And few men had the courage to stand against them. So Pharaoh wasn't worried. But he couldn't help but hear the comments, even of the most seasoned charioteers. They muttered around evening campfires of the powers of unknown gods. The darkness and the fog had thrown them for a loop, and it led to all kinds of irresponsible talk. And there was one more thing that troubled both the king and the men. All night long, there was a strange wind that blew across them from the east. It was a wind so strong that it would blow down tents and spook the horses. And yet, it did not seem strong enough to move the dark cloud that had descended over the camp. Men called it a god wind, and for many of them it was the worst omen of the battle that they were anticipating on the next day. No one slept well in the Egyptian camp that night. But Pharaoh took comfort in the thought that on the morrow, victory would wash all dark talk of strange gods and omens away. The dawn brought new surprises. The sun came up red, a bad sign indeed. With the sunrise also came an end to the unrelenting wind that blew from the east. And for a while the stillness of the air was even more eerie than the supernatural wind had been. But nothing prepared for the Egyptians for what they saw when the sun finally burned off the fog. Pharaoh looked down to see that the shores of the Red Sea were not where they were supposed to be. The great east wind had blown so hard, it seemed, that the marshy waters of the lake had been forced to retreat. But actually that was not what attracted Pharaoh's attention. He saw that the Hebrew slaves were taking advantage of the situation and making their way across the muddy terrain left by the retreating waters. And it was an orderly retreat. They were not panicking or screaming, just methodically making their way to freedom. And that, more than anything, infuriated Pharaoh. They weren't afraid of him. He was the scourge of the world, and yet it was as if he was nothing to them. The rage felt by the Pharaoh was shared by all of his charioteers who surrounded him on every side. The horses were also as excited as the men and tossed their heads and stamped the earth. No one ordered the charge that followed. No one even stopped to consider whether it was wise under the circumstances. It just happened. All the chariots of Egypt charged headlong across the muddy ground left by the retreating sea of reeds. And there, in short order, they stopped. The ground that had been crossed with relative ease by a group of slaves on foot was completely unforgiving to the spoked wheels of the chariots. Within moments, the wheels were clogged with mud, and the horses were in muck up above their knees. They could barely move. Every effort only seemed to make things worse. Soon the axles were buried, and the horses were helpless. And in that moment, Pharaoh cared not for his chariots, many of which were damaged far beyond repair, nor for the horses' broken legs and torn ligaments. He did not care for his soldiers who floundered about seeking only to save themselves. He only looked with hatred towards the retreating backs of the Hebrew slaves as they continued to move on without panic or fear. And that was what terrified the king. The story of the battle of the Sea of Reeds is one of the foundational stories of the ancient people of Israel. It was a story that was told and retold, much like the Americans tell the story of George Washington and the cherry tree, and the British tell the story of King Alfred and the cakes. So it's really not surprising that there are multiple versions of that story in the Bible. There seem to be 4, at least in Exodus alone. We have the poetic versions, the Song of Moses and the Song of Miriam, that appear to be quite ancient. And before the poetry accounts, we have 3 prose accounts that seem to have been mixed and mingled together. In this chapter in the book of Exodus, you will find what I like to call the CGI version of the battle. You know, the one where God sends a mighty and terrible blast of wind that makes the waters of the sea stand up like 2 walls on either side of the passing Israelites. And then God casts the Egyptians into the sea. This is, of course, a very familiar story, one highlighted in retellings like Cecil B. DeMille's The 10 Commandments. But if you look carefully at the text, you can see that there is another story embedded in it. The story I tried to tell here today. In this story, God acts much more subtly. In this story, God sends a much gentler wind, a constant wind out of the east that blows all night long and pushes back the water of the marshy shores of the Sea of Reeds. This creates a passage that allows the Hebrew slaves to escape on foot, but when the chariots attempt the same passage, they become mired in the muck. Now, there's no question that the CGI version of the story is much more impressive and cinematic. But there must be a good reason why that other story, what I like to call the East Wind version, got preserved and did not get edited out of the final version of the book of Exodus. It seems to me that we learn something different about God in the East Wind version of the story of the battle. In this story, God takes this foundation of the strength of Egypt, this latest military hardware in which they have invested so heavily, and defeats it with the oldest technology in the world, mud and sandal leather. The chariots are supposed to be Egypt's greatest strength, in which they have invested so heavily that it has distorted their economy, requiring them to oppress untold numbers of slaves. And yet God turns the chariots into the cause of their defeat. Now, that's a God I find very interesting, very compelling. It is also a God who seems to have been very active throughout human history. I mean, how many times down through the centuries have the great powers and empires invested so much in the technology of war and power, only to see those investments wasted by the emergence of some low-tech, low-investment response? Think, for example, of the massive ships of the Persian Empire, rowed by slaves taken from all over Asia, and how they were taken down by the tiny ships rowed by the freedmen of Athens at the Battle of Salamis. Or think of the huge numbers of the French nobility, riding horses and wearing armor that were so expensive that they required the support of millions of peasants, and yet they were brought down by the yeoman archers of England at the Battle of Agincourt. This is a pattern that we have also seen more recently in the streets of Portland, Oregon in the United States, for example, when federal agents deployed the latest in non-lethal chemical weaponry against protesters, only to be effectively countered, for a while at least, by a wall of dads wielding leaf blowers of all things. Yeah, it seems to keep on happening and makes me wonder whether the God that we worship has a way of surprising all those who seek to rely on the tools of power to maintain their own positions. We have all heard the story of the Battle of the Reed Sea. I think the temptation when we hear this story is to identify with Moses and the slaves. We want to be them, yearning to be free, yearning for a God who would set us free. Today, I wanted to tell the story from the other side, for one big reason, because I suspect that to the extent that we rely for our security on the tools of power and violence, we ought to be identifying with the Egyptians in this story. And if that is the case, well, God might have a surprise in store for us too. Let us pray. God, you are the King of kings and Lord of lords. You have taught us again and again in the Bible not to rely on horses and chariots, not to rely on the symbols of power and violence to find safety. You've taught us to find safety in you. But we resist that lesson. Thank you that you don't stop teaching us. Make us open to hear. Amen.